how the conference is going and who we might have engaged here on our session.
Wonderful. So the Arizona Food Bank Network is basically a state association. You're familiar with those of food banks across the state of Arizona, but we also partner with organizations in Texas and New Mexico and even into California to make sure that we share food here in the Southwest. And many of the folks on the call here today or on the video today are from the food pantries that we serve across the state. We have a number of folks who are volunteers, folks who are just generally interested in making sure that that we feed the hungry and those folks in our communities that don't have access to food. As you know, Arizona is a very large state, so we have folks all the way up from the Four Corners area, all the way down to the Nogales border and into Yuma. We have a variety of folks who are here from state agencies who have to work in the SNAP program, administering TFAP and school meals. SNAP education and outreach is here. So a variety of folks here in the audience today.
That is super helpful. That's great. Good. Very good. And remind me too, how long are we going on the session?
We are going until 11:45 today.
Great. So we have just under an hour. Okay. So I'll start my presentation, but I would really encourage, we've got a nice group here. Feel free to take yourself off of mute and ask a question, give a comment. It's a lot more fun than just me talking for an hour. So let me go ahead and advance my slides. So I would imagine that many of you have not heard of me or the groups that I work with. So let me introduce myself. I'm Katie Martin, and I work at Connecticut Food Bank Food Share, which we will soon have a new name. We have been the two regional food banks in the state of Connecticut, and just 2 months ago we merged. So we now have one statewide food bank. We are members of Feeding America. And in 2019, we created the Institute for Hunger Research and Solutions at Food Share. And the goal of the Institute is to serve as a resource for other food banks, food pantries, and community partners by providing strategies and technical assistance materials for holistic solutions to hunger. So if you're interested in this type of work, which I would think by joining this session you very likely might be, I would encourage you to subscribe to our institute. If you go to foodshare.org/institute, we have monthly newsletters where we provide updates, resources, research briefs, articles. We also host monthly webinar series on various topics. And for folks who are interested in diving deeper on some of these topics, we also provide consulting services. And through the Institute, our 4 main goals are increasing access to healthy, nutritious food, addressing root causes of hunger, identifying best practices, research and evaluation. And the 4th goal is creating a paradigm shift, moving away from short-term responses to hunger towards longer-term solutions. And that's a lot about what we're going to be talking today. So let's see. Excellent. Let's see. So I think part of the reason that Jeff Bender, who works at the Arizona Food Bank Network, invited me to speak with you all today is I recently wrote a book. This is the beautiful cover. It's Reinventing Food Banks and Pantries, New Tools to End Hunger. And the goal of my book is bold yet simple. It's to reinvent the way that we think about the problem of hunger in America and the way that we go about tackling it. And it's meant to be really inspirational. I provide examples of innovative practices that are happening around the country And it's also meant to be action oriented. So at the end of every chapter, I have action steps that you can take today in your community. I provide background and history of the charitable food system, how we got to the place where we are today with our massive network of food banks and food pantries that serve basically every community in the United States. I touch upon issues like client choice, the role of volunteers, promoting healthy food, systemic change, advocacy, and new partnerships. So it's been really exciting. The book was published March 9th, just last month. And I'm hearing from a lot of folks around the country who are finding value in the book and using it in their food banks and food pantries. So I'd love to hear what you may think. Dave, I'm reading your comment. That's so thoughtful. If you don't mind going off of mute and letting me know which group you're with, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, yeah, this is Dave Richards with United Food Bank. I think we've corresponded just a little bit.
Yeah.
Email. We ordered, back behind me is the box that all of the books came in.
Yeah.
This book, guys, it's great. I mean, you said things that we talked about on many occasions for Food Bank, and it was. I think in my email to you, I said I felt like I wasn't crazy after all.
Yes.
That there are better ways to do this, and so we just happen to be also in the middle of our strategic planning sessions with our board, and so we're incorporating a lot of the ideas into our discussions with our board, we haven't got all the copies out, but we've been giving them to all of our board members, so they're well informed about the direction I think we should go. This is food banking, I don't know, 3.0, 4.0. It's certainly not 2.0. It's far more advanced so it gets away from the transaction of just handing people food and really thinking deeper. And just absolutely love it. So I was thrilled that you were presenting at this conference. So I'll stop. This is about you, not me. So.
No, it means a lot. It makes my heart sing because that's exactly why I wanted to write this book, because I think we're doing really, really good work in the charitable food system, but I think we can do better. So that's great. So there's information here. The publisher is Island Press. If you put my last name Martin in, you can get 20% off. I can tell you they're doing a promotion this week for ebooks. They're selling them for $4.99. So if you prefer an ebook, go and pick up a copy. Cool. So a lot of people have been asking me, what was my motivation? Why did I choose to write this? I mean, honestly, I wrote it so that folks like Dave and others could inform their strategic planning process in food banks and pantries. But when I was fresh out of college, I chose to intern with the food bank for New York City. And this large picture here is imagery from what I described in my book. I spent the summer as a food bank monitor, and so my job was to go and visit various food pantries throughout greater New York. And when I stepped off the subway and I was walking towards the food pantry on a beautiful Friday morning in Manhattan, this is what I saw. And there were people lined up all along the sidewalk. And as I got closer, the line just wrapped around the corner and down the street. And people would move slowly towards the front of the line. And the food pantry was located in the basement of one of these buildings. And so as I got closer, I could see that you had to go down the steps and volunteers were bagging food and handing the food person to person assembly line up the steps to the next person, and they would hand it to the people on the street. And it wasn't a very glamorous outfit. And it just really struck me that there must be a better way to tackle the problem of hunger in our wealthy society like the United States. And then this picture here on the right is obviously during COVID. This is 26 years later. And in many ways, I feel like not a whole lot has changed in the way that we focus on the issue of hunger. And the other key motivation for writing this book is for that end user, for the folks who are coming to receive food in the food pantry lines. They are predominantly people of color. They are predominantly single moms of color. And that is something that motivates me when I design programs, when I'm evaluating programs. It's to think of what will the impact be on the single mom and ensuring that she has enough food for her family, and hopefully so that we can stop the cycle of poverty and food insecurity for the next generation. We're going to talk a little bit about systemic inequalities and the impact specifically in COVID. One thing that has been really intriguing as I'm talking with more people who've been reading my book is it's interesting. One of the key concepts that people seem to focus on is this notion of scarcity mentality. And we often think about this for the people we serve, for vulnerable folks who are food insecure, visiting, shopping at food pantries, that they're focused on the scarcity mentality, that they're worried about having enough food at the end of the week, at the end of the month, there isn't enough money, support, and time. So the types of coping strategies you take as an individual is you're just trying to get through today, right? You're making tough trade-off decisions. Are you going to pay for food or rent or utilities? But I think what's important for us in the charitable food system is that at the organizational level, we often struggle with this same scarcity mentality, that we feel like at the food bank, at the food pantry, there isn't enough food, money, time, volunteers, space, equipment to do the work we need to do. And since we don't have enough, and because there's so many people who need food, we should just focus on providing enough food. Let's just keep our head down and focus on getting more food out to more folks. So we also have coping strategies in that we focus on pounds of food, and we tend not to think longer term strategically and preparing and trying to prevent people from needing food in the first place. And this keeps us stuck in a focus on emergency food. I don't know about all of you, but when you think about your organizations and the work you do, how many of you, even before COVID, continue to use the terminology of emergency food? I know it's something that I see frequently. We had a board meeting, a strategic planning board meeting yesterday, and one of our board members said, part of our main mission is providing emergency food. And these images are from a few years ago here at Food Share, and they look a whole lot like those images from Lower Manhattan in 1994. They look a whole like the focus we've had on this emergency of a public health pandemic. But the fact of the matter is we've been providing emergency food for decades. And we do a really, really great job of it. Collectively as a network, we provide billions of pounds of food to millions of Americans. But if we really want to stop the cycle, we need to change the way that we describe the work that we do and the way that we do our work. Because an emergency that lasts for decades is really a misnomer. This is a chronic situation. And as we move from a crisis mentality, we can move more towards prevention, moving from emergency towards empowerment. And Angie, just let me know if there's questions. I'll check the chat box as we
You're doing great. I think I put in some places to get the books. I know folks are excited about that. So that's what's in there right now. And also people are private messaging me saying, where can I get a copy? And so we may make some copies available to you, and you and I can talk offline. So
awesome. Great. So not only do I think the term emergency food is really a misnomer and doesn't really reflect the work that we do, but when you're focused on an emergency response, it reduces our ability and our opportunities for evaluating the work that we do. In the book, I talk about this in a couple of different ways. And I describe how even though we have food banks and food pantries in nearly every community around the United States, we really, until very recently, have not conducted rigorous research to evaluate the work that we do. And I think it is a humongous missed opportunity. And I highlight three key reasons why I think we tend not to evaluate our work. And the first is that if we think of our work as an emergency response, you don't tend to evaluate an emergency. And when I think of, a classic emergency, an emergency that we've just been experiencing through COVID, is this unexpected, short-term trauma. You think of a natural disaster, a hurricane, a tornado. When something like that type of an emergency hits, you don't evaluate it. People need blankets, they need clothing, they need water. You get those as quickly as possible. I can very easily think back a year ago. I'm sure you all can too. In charitable food work, all of our pants were on fire, right? I mean, it was like, we're just trying to keep our head above water. There are so many people in need. None of it. Are we supposed to wear masks yet? Are we not? How are we keeping safe? What do we do with social distancing? We were dealing with an emergency. But now that a year has gone by, and we're starting to look ahead on the other side of COVID, it's time to really reflect on, again, the chronic nature of the work that we do. The second reason I think we tend not to evaluate our work is because we think of this charitable work as inherently good. There are a lot of beneficiaries, a lot of people who benefit from providing charitable food. And I have this, it's just a simple photo, but you can think of how many people just inherently really, really like the idea of giving free food to folks, volunteers, food donors, financial donors. When we inherently just think this is a good idea and anecdotally we feel great about it, we tend not to look at the other side of, let's evaluate our work and make sure that we're doing the type of good that we want to be doing. I think the third reason that we have a lack of evaluation is how we define our success. Typically, historically, even though we've been doing this work for a really long time, and there are so many thoughtful, smart, innovative people in our network, we tend to define our success in terms of outputs, the number of pounds that we distribute, the number of people that we serve. These are outputs. These are not outcomes. And, we can show the growth in our work, and year over year, we can serve more pounds to more people. And for a very long time, I think most of us felt really good about that. And for a very long time, I think our financial supporters, our donors, our foundations felt really good about that. Increasingly, folks are questioning, we really like giving money to you as a food bank or a food pantry, but can you tell us more about the impact that you're having for the people that you serve? So I think there are lots of different ways that we can look at how we describe our programs, how we move away from a short-term emergency response, and how we evaluate the work that we do. So again, I think the way we define a problem helps to define our solutions to that problem. So if we define the problem of hunger in America as there isn't enough food, which makes sense, right? People are hungry, they're food insecure because they don't have enough food, then our solution becomes very simple. We should collect and distribute more food. We've done a really, really great job of this, right? And the way that we can measure our success is through these outputs, the number of pounds, or we can do a conversion to the number of meals and the number of people that we serve. And typically we like to say that these are constantly going up. I had a really great conversation last week with Phil Trimble who works at the Greater Cleveland Food Bank, and we were talking about the notion of pounds versus meals. And he said, we're in the business of ingredients, right? Like, we're not necessarily just providing pounds of food, we're providing ingredients that people can bring home and make meals for themselves. And I love that idea. Typically, when we think about not having enough, the focus is on efficiency and moving more pounds of food to more people all the time. If, on the other hand, we define the problem of hunger in America as being much more complex, as rooted in poverty and things like stagnant wages, underemployment, lack of affordable housing, healthcare, childcare, lack of access to healthy, nutritious food, if we define the problem of food insecurity as rooted in systemic inequalities and structural racism, then our solutions become a whole lot more complex. But they also become more holistic, they become more coordinated, because none of us can solve this complex problem on our own, right? We need to coordinate with others to do this work. And this is where the paradigm starts. The paradigm shifting is recognizing these are the root causes of why people don't have food in America, have enough food in the United States of America. It's not that we don't have enough food, it's that we have these underlying structural issues at play. And so our solutions then can focus more on policy changes, on advocacy, collaborating with new partners, new organizations, letting go of our egos so that we can collaborate with other partners that we may have not collaborated with so much in the past, focusing on healthy, nutritious food, including those with lived experience in our solutions, asking the folks that we serve for their input, for their involvement and their engagement, and evaluating what works and what doesn't work so well, and measuring outcomes. Hopefully, you all are familiar with, especially at the food bank level, the Foods to Encourage standard that Feeding America uses. And hopefully you have at least heard of the new nutrition guidelines that have been developed through Healthy Eating Research, which is a national program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. This is the cover of the report that was released a year ago. These guidelines were developed by a panel of folks convened by Healthy Eating Research, and I was proud to serve as a member of the panel. It involved nutrition folks from around the country. Marlene Schwartz and Hillary Seligman were the co-chairs, and there were folks like me who work at food banks to make sure that this is really practical and feasible at a food bank level. Feeding America is encouraging, but not yet requiring food banks to use these new guidelines. At FoodShare, we have a stoplight system called SWAP, Supporting Wellness at Pantries. This is the logo of SWAP. And SWAP is now 100% aligned with these new guidelines. And SWAP is a set of tools that can help you to use these guidelines at a food bank or a food pantry. And I'm working really closely with food banks and food pantries around the country to implement these new guidelines, because then once we all are using these same guidelines, we'll have national standards, which can lead to data and evaluation and metrics so that we can look at our inventories to measure the nutritional quality of the pounds of food or the meals or the ingredients that we're providing. The pie chart and little bar chart are just example data from FoodShare from a couple years ago when we started using SWAP. So you can see in the pie chart that half of our inventory was green, a good portion was yellow. There's a big purple pie slice that is salvage or not ranked. So recognizing that the miscellaneous food items that you have from your retail partners, when the tractor trailer load comes and it's filled with miscellaneous food products from the grocery store, that's going to be harder to rank. So there are ways to get you started ranking food nutritionally, recognizing that not all of it will be ranked. You can then look by food category to see how you're doing, to set benchmarks, to see which areas you're doing really great and where there's room for improvement. We've also created these new food donor report cards so that we can identify our retail partners, our grocery stores that donate food to us routinely, to identify the superstars, who are the folks that are doing great work providing healthy, nutritious food, and where is there room for improvement. Building relationships with our retail partners to encourage them to supply more green and yellow foods and let them know why we're not as interested in the red foods. That's because the people we serve aren't as interested in getting red foods at the food pantries. They're not looking for snacks and desserts. They're looking for other nutritious food. So this is an example of how to evaluate the work that we're doing and move more towards other types of metrics.
Katie, we don't have any questions in the chat, but folks are definitely emphasizing thank you so much for this information. It's great perspective. I just want to ask you a quick question about your donor report cards. Is that something that you shared publicly, or is that something that you just shared privately with individual donors?
It's a great question. So at this point, at our food bank, the manager who works with our food donors, and particularly like our retail stores, she's using this in one-on-one conversations with them. So she will share these reports with them individually, but we're not broadcasting it. I think down the road, what we're hoping is to be able to share it so that we could have information of all of our food donors and then the donor specifically of how do they compare to others. It's kind of like when your electric company sends you a report saying, you're using twice as much electricity as your neighbors. Don't you think you should be using less electricity? It encourages you to have better behavior. I think there's a lot of room for growth here. We've started to use these and it helps. Data is just powerful. So by understanding what you have in your inventory, you start that internally. You start within your food bank, that can help inform your nutrition policies. It can help inform how you talk with your donors. So we're using that more on one-on-one relationship conversations. Does that make sense?
That's perfect. Thank you.
Great. So in terms of the other complex issues and the root causes of why people are food insecure, at FoodShare, we have an initiative that we call More Than Food. And it's a holistic view of looking at a food pantry and providing client choice, connecting people to community resources, and emphasizing a culture that is dignified, empowering, welcoming. And it's based on the premise that it takes more than food to end hunger. And, one of the things that strikes me is that we know that millions of people are food insecure in the United States, but they're hungry for more than just food. They're hungry for change. They're hungry for connection. They're hungry for justice. So how do we create space and an environment in a food pantry setting that is empowering, and these are just a few examples of how we can move along that spectrum of creating this paradigm shift of moving away from a traditional model where people wait in line, they get to the front of the line, they're handed a bag of food, they come back 2 weeks later, a month later, they're handed a bag of food, to creating opportunities to provide warm referrals to community resources. And by warm referrals, we mean where an individual, either a volunteer or staff at the food pantry, has a relationship, has a conversation with someone to understand what are some of the other challenges that are going on in their life, to understand what kind of referral would be beneficial, and then being able to provide not just a brochure or a phone number, but to sit with someone and say, you know, can you sit down here and I can give you information for how to enroll in SNAP? You know, do you know about this childcare voucher or a transportation voucher or other resources, classes? Would you like information for how to sign up? Should we make a phone call together? Having space within a food pantry to provide wraparound services. And this is where community partnerships are so critical, that a food pantry does not have to be an expert on all of the other systemic issues that a person may be struggling with, nor does a food pantry have to offer all of those programs themselves. But it's really ideal if you can work closely with other community agencies, organizations, services to find out what their programs and offerings are. Invite them to come to your food pantry to either help enroll people in their program or to offer classes and workshops on site. So providing more of a one-stop shop experience, make it easier for people to meet their other needs that are going on beyond just food. If folks are hoping to dig deeper with offering more than food, we do trainings for coaches to provide motivational interviewing, which is based on social work skills. And that's a longer commitment where a coach will work with an individual, you know, over the course of usually 3 to 9 months. The other thing I would stress here is really providing space for people to engage with one another. This is where you can have opportunities to build community, build social capital, build opportunities for people to become advocates, not just for their own lives, but to be advocates in the community. We had a webinar yesterday as part of our monthly webinar series where we did an intro to More Than Food. And I invited a food pantry staff member from Rhode Island who's been doing these types of wraparound services. And they have a leadership council of people from that shop at their food pantry who are becoming leaders and raising their voices in the community, becoming advocates for community change. That's where we also are going to see the paradigm shift, is when it comes from the grassroots, from people who have lived experience. Through this work of offering more than food, we've been evaluating this work as we go. There's a lot of opportunities for measuring outcomes at the client level. So we can measure changes in food security, financial well-being, self-efficacy, self-sufficiency, diet quality. We have a lot of significant findings that when people visit a food pantry that offers more than food, and particularly when they offer coaching and goal setting, you can see some really significant decreases in food insecurity, significant increases in self-sufficiency. We also have a lot of great qualitative data from people who've participated to say the Fresh Start program helped me to prioritize and set goals for myself. It helped me by being positive, having a better outlook on life. Again, not just the focus on food and physical health, but the mental well-being, reducing the stress, the anxiety, the mental toll that comes with food insecurity. So these are examples of the types of outcomes we've measured. And I think as you create other wraparound services and space to build relationships and breaking down the power dynamics between clients who receive food and the volunteers who provide food, when you have more opportunities for building relationships, engaging with one another, you have more opportunities to ask what they think of the program, to evaluate your programs, to gather surveys or focus groups, do interviews to measure these types of outcomes.
And Katie, we just have a quick question. So do you have evaluation tools for those outcomes? And is that something you're willing to share?
Yeah, absolutely. And most of these are standardized tools. I've also been working with Feeding America. As you may know, there is a Feeding America client survey, facts, that they've been working with food banks and encouraging them to use. They have some resources, but absolutely, I have tools like this that I'm happy to share. Food security is the standardized USDA survey. There's a newer financial well-being survey that we've been using, and I'm happy to share other resources. So, yes. Another thing that's, I think, important in terms of the paradigm shift of moving from an emergency response towards more empowerment is paying close attention to the language that we use. And by that, I mean everything from our websites to the language we use when we're soliciting funding from donors, the way that we describe our programs, the type of language we use when people come into a food pantry to shop. How do we describe the work that we do and the people that we serve? And I think it's really important. Words are powerful, and I think we need to be careful of how we describe our work. I often encourage a strength-based approach, making sure that the language we use, particularly at a food pantry level, is welcoming, that it's person-centric. One of my pet peeves is when we describe how we are, feeding the hungry. There's just so much wrong with those few little words. First of all, we're actually not feeding them, nor do they really want to be fed. We're providing food, we're providing access to food. And, there's just a more dignified way to describe the work we do. But it's unfortunate, that I think some of this old school language gets carried on in the work that we do, and it perpetuates and gets part of our vernacular, and we need to change it. There's a lot of emphasis on being more trauma informed when we recognize that if you're struggling with food insecurity, that is a form of trauma. And if you're living in poverty, that is a traumatic experience. So how do we think about the way we provide food that can be more informed about the realities of dealing with trauma and how we can not cause more harm? Providing more of a hand up, not a handout, and really, helping people help themselves. And I've been involved with a couple conversations this past week where people talked about engaging people with lived experience in terms of being leaders, and they call them leaders instead of like a client advisory board, but like a leadership council. And I like the intentional use of those words, right? It has a different meaning when we talk about engaging leaders in our community. One of the things that we've been doing over the past few years here at FoodShare is ethical storytelling and gathering qualitative information from folks that we serve. And I encourage our team to ask people about their experience and to gather their input. And so we have a staff member named Andrew who is he's really skilled at his job. He takes beautiful photographs, but he really cares about this work, and he's engaged with this kind of storytelling. So when you think about evaluating the work that you do, it doesn't all have to be quantitative, longitudinal survey research. It can also be listening and asking people for their advice. And I will tell you that people like to be asked about their opinion. They want to be heard. And I think it goes a long way in reducing the stigma of the work that we do when we share beautiful photos and beautiful quotes of people's lived experience. This client, Brian, saying it's tough to admit when you need help, right? And the more folks that we can show, particularly during COVID times, of how many people we conducted some research at our drive-through distribution. 70% of the people we've served at our drive-through distribution last summer had never been to a food pantry before COVID, right? So these are folks who just never dreamed that they would be in this experience. So how do we take this opportunity to say, all of us need help sometimes, and when you fall on hard times, this is why we're here. How can we use this to reduce that stigma and those barriers? Just another example of, in our websites, in the language we use, in our marketing material, how do we show the strength, the dreams, the goals, the vitality of the people who we serve, as opposed to the problems, the challenges, the needs, right? So some of the key themes that I describe in my book and that I think are really important is that we are doing really good work in the charitable food system, but we can do better. We can aim higher. We can dream bigger than we have in the past. And these are some of the directional changes that I hope that we move away from sympathy. It must be really embarrassing. It must be really hard what you're experiencing, to more empathy. I want to hear about what you're going through. Shifting from pounds of food to the nutritional quality of the food, and from short-term transactions to transformations. Angie, are there any questions you want to highlight?
We do have a couple of really good ones. First, going back to what you said about your interactions with clients and collecting their what value you bring to them. Danielle had a question about, do you have a satisfaction survey to share? And when you survey those folks, how did you close the loop with them?
So I've heard of some other food banks that are doing, or food pantries that are doing some satisfaction surveys. It's a great question. I don't have standard questions that I know of, but that's a great question. I think you could base it, though, on the work that you do. I love the idea of Likert scales. So when you have a strongly disagree, agree, strongly agree type of, think of a 4-scale item that's kind of a Likert scale. Think of the services that you're offering and ask the opinions of folks for those types of things that you're doing, and how much do they agree or disagree, to gather their satisfaction. And then the feedback loop, I'm wondering if, Danielle, are you talking about the evaluation surveys that we do with the coaching?
Yeah, I think so. We've done a few surveys at St. Vincent de Paul, and we participated in a program of sorts called Listen for Good. And the closing the loop part, for me, was the most challenging, because we have such a rotating group of guests, of clients. But it felt important because when you're surveyed, you want to know why, and you want to know, at least for us, we were using it to try to bring impact to our services and change how we do things. So we wanted to be able to share that their opinion mattered, and this is what we did with it.
Right.
I struggled with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess some examples, some suggestions might be, so are you at a food pantry?
We run kind of, we have a food pantry, a food bank, and then we have 5 congregate dining halls. So we did the survey group in our family evening meal, where we serve families hot meals.
Yeah. Yeah. So, like if you have any public areas with like a bulletin board or some, standard area where you have flyers or information, you could put a 1-pager that just like, maybe the headline is, "We heard you." And like, you may remember that we asked you some questions, or, we surveyed X number of people. Here are some of the things that we heard. Like, you don't have to report on all of the data. I would say the simpler, the better, and make it in like a 1-pager or a 2-pager, English and Spanish, or, like based on the, the population that you're serving, and just high level, and maybe some of the key data points, but then also, like, you can tell, I like mixing quantitative with qualitative. So then maybe put a quote from somebody that, really speaks to what you heard. I think that's helpful. If you do like focus groups, it's easier because you probably have the contact information you could provide to folks. If you do a survey, it's a little bit hard to get that information back to people. I hear you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, I like that you're thinking that way though. Like so often we conduct research and it never goes back to the folks that, we asked.
Yeah, I think people want to know. They want to they want to hear everyone else's answers to the same questions. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Sure. And the other thing too is if people visit your website, you could also put up a little like just description, a little update, or if you do newsletters, there's different ways. And again, you don't have to report on all of the information that you found, but some. So one of the key themes in my book is the idea of reinventing, and reinvention takes creativity, it takes imagination. I think one of the silver linings of COVID is that we've all had to reinvent ourselves personally, professionally. We've all had to flip our lives kind of upside down. We'll never be able to say, this is how I've always done things. We've all had to mix things up. So as hard as that has been, I'm hopeful that this is really a perfect time to imagine what your network, what your food pantry, what your food bank could look like, how it might be different. Think about what's possible. These are just some of the themes that I talk about in my book. And one of the other key themes is take one step. That, I describe it a lot like a menu, that you don't have to tackle all of these. It's very, very likely that you're already doing a lot of these really well. There's probably other things that I haven't even touched upon that you're doing extraordinarily well. And I would love to hear about those. But maybe there are a couple areas where you say, yeah, this is an area we want to focus on, and take one step. I encourage folks to don't get intimidated, just get started. Think of an area, take a few steps. There's a lot of room for improvement. And this reinvention is going to take all of us. It's thinking about the full spectrum. And I think of, even really thinking upstream. If we want to improve the nutritional quality of our food, it's not just providing education for the folks who shop in our food pantries. It's talking with our food donors. It's talking with the food manufacturers. It's thinking upstream. If we want to help the people in our food pantries improve their employment, we can provide help with their resume and getting an email account and doing job training, but we should also be working with the employers in our community, making sure that they're, hiring, that they're providing good livable wages for the people that they hire. And I'm happy to take any additional questions, comments. Again, encourage you to subscribe to our institute. You can follow me on Twitter. My email is at the bottom, kmartin@foodshare.org. And I'm really happy to engage in other conversations if you guys want to dig deeper.
We definitely have some questions for you in the chat. So I'll pitch them right now. Wendy's asking, in collecting stories, sometimes we feel like we're being very insensitive, obviously asking people to fill out a photo release or the ability to share their story with someone else at a very vulnerable time. Do you have tips for how you talked about ethical storytelling?
Yeah, and there's a whole website that goes with that. I think it's like ethicalstorytelling.com. I list that in the book, but I think it starts with how you approach it. If you approach it as like, I'm really sorry, like this is going to be really hard and embarrassing, it's probably going to come across really awkward and weird. If you approach it as, a lot of times what I suggest is it's creating the space, taking the opportunity to put yourself in a scenario where you're with people who you're serving. And then as you're having conversations, And you're not necessarily just jumping right in with, can I get a quote from you? You're kind of just having that conversation. How are you doing today? Is the food helpful for you? Are there other, things that would be helpful for you? And as you're having a conversation and someone is telling you some really great story, then you could segue into, what, that's so helpful. And I think it would be really great if we could share that story with others so that we know there are many other people who are in your same shoes. Would you be willing to share that story? So you're already having a conversation, and then it just segues into that. Some people will say no, and absolutely respect that. I think if you start with a less intimidating, lead in, and then, having the photo release is great, but it could also be, would you be willing to share this anonymously? You can share your first name, not any of your name. You could share your town or not. You don't have to have a photo with it. I think getting started with this work, I think you get more comfortable over time. That helps.
Agreed. Liz asked a really great question about how your budget has been affected by these shifts. Have you had to raise additional money to do this? If the costs are greater, obviously that make it difficult for small pantries or for others to take this on. I like your idea of one step at a time, but I do wonder, has this had an impact on your budget?
I'm going to stop sharing this. I guess it depends on which component we're talking about. Doing offering more than food, particularly with a coach, costs more money. You get better, you get what you pay for, you get a bigger bang for that. But we've also seen coaching with part-time coaches. Some have been volunteer, although that doesn't tend to work as effectively as paid staff. Shifting to client choice actually does not necessarily have to cost more money. It's just reconfiguring the way that your food pantry looks. Training volunteers to provide more customer service does not have to cost a lot of money. It kind of, I think it depends on what you're describing. So some things, yes, it does, but not all of them. And I think the other thing I would mention is I think there are more funders that are interested in these types of more holistic approaches. You can raise different types of money, recruit different types of funders when you're talking about root causes, when you're talking about social determinants of health, reducing health disparities. So it may cost more money, but you also may bring in more money.
I think that's a great point. I think we only have a couple more minutes. I don't see any more comments or questions, I guess, in the chat. Folks love the shift of providing nutritious food, encouraging healthy food choices. I will ask you, this book was probably in production prior to COVID, or at least the ideas were in your brain. Yeah. And when you think about the efficiencies or the ways we've had to change our business during COVID to being, again, drive up models, very low touch interactions, seeing more and more individuals and folks who are not familiar with our charitable food response, coming to us with lots of questions. Did you revert to some old habits, or how long around the path have you been? Or can you talk a little bit about COVID, I guess?
Oh, yeah. I would say the biggest gut punch for me was at the beginning of COVID, that the first thing to go was client choice. And I mean, you can just tell how I just feel like that's kind of where a lot of this paradigm shift starts, is when you're providing food that everybody gets the same type of food, and you shift to client choice, it shifts so many other things in a food pantry. So when COVID hit and it was like, oh gosh, we're going back to just giving people bags of food. And I get it. I have a background in public health. So, I mean, I totally understand it. But I think that hopefully we're going to get back. I'm hearing from more food pantries who are ready to re-engage with client choice. That's actually the topic of our webinar in May. So.
Wonderful.
Danielle, you've got a question.
Yeah, I had a question about language shift.
Yeah.
I agree, it's so important. I think my biggest struggle with our kind of network of volunteers and people in our organization is that like it's so hard to make that shift happen. We have a lot of the old school, and do you have any advice on how to help make that shift in a pretty big network of people?
Is there one language shift you want to make? Is like there one terminology?
I mean, even just like feeding the hungry, and it's I've really tried to make an effort when I speak that, we're providing access to nutrition, it's and access to choice and that dignity piece. And because we just have a lot of the old school where it's feeding the hungry, but people like even just the nutrition piece, changing that state of mind where it's like, well, people like hot dogs and ramen. Sure, what's not to like? But like, let's provide nutritious food and just changing that mentality and getting that value there.
Yeah, I guess my suggestion might be like tackle one. So maybe the feeding the hungry, like start there. And I'm a really big advocate of really just hone in on the why. Why does it matter? Why is it important? Why is that outdated? What's the alternative? So when you really, when you show the alternative, like feeding the hungry versus like providing food for our neighbors, like imagine that you lost your job and you had to get help. Would you want to be in the, part of the feeding the hungry? Would you want to be like, have people try to imagine what that would be if they were walking in those shoes. But I would say don't try to tackle all of them. Maybe hone in on one, and then it'll start the ripple effect.
Thank you.
Yeah. Trainings are important. Yeah.
This has been really wonderful, Katie. We really appreciate your time with us today. Several folks have said this has been helpful. Greatly appreciate it. You provided your email, you provided your social media. I encourage folks to use that. If anyone has challenges getting a hold of Katie, please reach out to me. I'm sure we can find you, no problem. So thank you again for being with us today. We really appreciate it, and we hope you have a great day in Connecticut.
Thank you so much, everyone. Stay healthy. Be happy. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Mhm. Mhm.
But what I want to teach you is a little thing I like to call my way. Now with my way, what's going to happen is I'm going to have you have your hands out like this. You'll be wiggling them. And I'm going to count to 3. Yes, jazz hands. Thank you, Tara. Jazz hands, spirit fingers, whatever you'd like to call it. But on the count of 3, we're going to end up bringing our hands together. We're going to do what's called interdigitation. It means we're going to interlock our fingers and crisscross our thumbs on top. So we're going to do that on the count of 3. Now I see Miss Bobby Norris. She looks like she's ready to have a lot of fun over there. Big smile right now.